Reid is the son of Harry Reid. Now, Rory Reid is a lobbyist for a giant Chinese energy conglomerate, and they want to build a $5 billion solar farm in the Nevada desert. And what better spot to build a solar farm than on the same property that this Bundy guy is using? Now, it's not exactly the same property. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying he had his eye on that exact same parcel. But what they want to do is they want to clear the desert in Nevada, Rory Reid, with Harry Reid. And remember, the guy that was in charge of the BLM in Nevada was a former aide to Harry Reid, used to work for Harry Reid. Harry Reid saw to it that he's now managing the BLM. So you got Harry Reid, his buddy running the BLM. They want to clear out the ranchers so Rory Reid, Harry Reid's son, can go out and get some kind of Chinese conglomerate to come in and build a solar farm on the desert in Nevada. I mean, it's just obscene what is going on there. So here's Rory Reid taking the high road, talking about what he thinks ought to happen to Cliven Bundy.
We believe in a country in which we're subject to laws, and we can't just ignore the laws that we don't like. And I think that clearly, if state and federal prosecutors look at this more closely, they're going to find that he broke the law and he should be prosecuted.
Well, my response to Rory Reid, well, why don't you try telling President Obama that you can't ignore the laws you don't happen to like? That's an exact quote from Rory Reid. You can't just ignore the laws we don't like. Well, tell that to President Obama. He shows no regard for laws. If he doesn't like a law, he simply does not enforce it whatsoever. So, bottom line is if Bundy ought to be prosecuted, then according to Rory Reid, President Obama should be prosecuted. You can't prosecute a president, so you impeach him. So if Cliven Bundy should be prosecuted, President Obama, according to Rory Reid standards, ought to be impeached. Now, this is clip number 4. This is Rand Paul, and Rand Paul predictably is on the other side of this conversation. He says, well, yeah, the rule of law is important, but it applies to more than just ranchers.
We can't have in America people that violate the law and just walk away from it. So it's not over.
You first, federal government. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I think there's an opposite thing to what Harry Reid said, and that's the federal government shouldn't violate the law, nor should we have 48 federal agencies carrying weapons and having SWAT teams. Can everybody decide what the law is on their own? No, there has to be a legal process. But I think there is definitely a philosophic debate over who should own this land. And apparently, this is what I'm hearing, the family had a lease with the county of Clark County for over 130 years. Arbitrarily, in recent years, the federal government decided they were going to override the county lease and they were going to assume control of it, but they never asked for permission from the rancher.
Right.
So there is a valid debate here, but I don't like to see things descend into violence, and I hope it'll go through a court. But if it were in a court, I would be siding and wanting to say that, look, the states and the individuals in the states should own these lands.
Yeah.
80% of Nevada is owned by the federal government. We need to get it back to the state of Nevada, so when there's a bunch of chickens running around or tortoise, that we try to protect them, but at the same time we don't do it at the expense of people.
Yeah.
All right, so that's Senator Rand Paul, and I think he's exactly right. What in the world is the federal government doing owning 80% of the land in Nevada? They own 63% of the land in my home state of Idaho. What is up with that? Where do you find in Article 1, Section 8 any authority for the federal government to manage land within the sovereign borders of an individual state? In other words, when the federal government creates a state, then by law, all of the land in that state ought to belong to that state. So that's what Rand Paul is saying ought to happen. I think he's exactly right. Get this land, if it's public land, get it under the control of state officials. They can do with it whatever they wish. Now, one last clip. This is Judge Napolitano, clip number 5. And he's talking about where this crisis is at and what he sees coming. Now, he's talking to Sean Hannity here. And Sean Hannity says, look, we have 200 agents surrounding this guy's ranch and stealing his cows. I mentioned that yesterday. We don't allow soldiers to carry on an Army base, but here you've got bureaucrats armed to the eyeballs. What is up with that? Snipers hanging out on the outside perimeter of the ranch. We don't even secure our border anywhere near this way. In fact, I've said, look, if only our government would show as much concern for trespassing illegal aliens as they do for trespassing cows, we wouldn't have a problem on the southern border. And Hannity says, look, this is heavy-handed. No matter who's right in this dispute or not, this seems like an overreach from the federal government. And Judge Napolitano agrees and says, look, there are other ways that the federal government not only could have handled this, but should have handled this.
I personally know the sheriff to whom you're referring, and I know him to be a person of the highest intellectual honesty. He also has the highest fidelity to the Constitution, as do the deputies who work for him and who used to work for him. And so I do believe that the most dangerous part of this is yet to come. Look, the federal government has a legitimate, valid court order, but they don't have to enforce it by bringing in militaristic techniques. They don't have to enforce it by stealing his private property. They can enforce it by filing a document in a courthouse, which will enable them to collect the money to which they're entitled when he dies or when his property otherwise passes to somebody else, and they know that.
So Judge Napolitano said, look, they should have gone to court instead of to his ranch if they got an issue. And, what he was talking about in the first part of that soundbite, Sean Hannity referring to a sheriff who said, look, I think that the federal government is getting ready to stage a raid on this ranch. And Judge Napolitano says, look, I know that sheriff. He's a man of impeccable reputation. If he says that there's a possibility of a late night, early morning raid on this ranch, then you can take it to the bank that that's a possibility. They may be considering that. What they ought to be doing is going to court. Now, there's this letter written by Kina Lyle Gleckner. She is a rancher, a fellow rancher in Nevada. And she points out, well, I'll have to finish this up when we come back out of the break, but I'll give you a little bit more details. She's a rancher. She's there in Nevada. She knows the ins and outs of all of these leases and water rights and forage rights and grazing rights and all that kind of stuff. And she says, look, Cliven Bundy, basically bottom line, he's only obligated to pay fees for grazing if he has signed this binding document with the BLM, and he never signed it. You don't pay the fees until you sign the document. And he says, I'm not going to sign it. He still hasn't signed it. Therefore, he has no legal obligation to pay the fees because you only pay the fees after you sign the document. He hasn't signed it. Focal Point, AFR Talk.